Hey y'all, welcome to this week's show. Today we're mainly going to talk about oak. We've discussed oak before, we're going to discuss oak again. Oak is one of the most important plants in all of herbal medicine. This is, yes, Quercus, the oak tree. For that, I've got just a brief mention of a shrub called Pyralaria, or buffalo nut. It is a native to the Americas. Very, very little used in herbal medicine, but if you got one in your yard, you might as well try to figure out how to use it. It's also called oil nut, but mainly buffalo nut. The plant has been used as a salve, S-A-L-V-E, on sores, especially old sores, helping them to heal up. And however, the seed, if you chew it, it will induce vomiting. So probably not one you're going to use for food, but very useful to know. It's also been used in the treatment of colic, but I really don't have any information as to how. So now we will get into oak. Now there are 69 varieties of oak that have documented use in herbal medicine. That said, there are many, many, many oaks. Oaks grow pretty much all over the world. Just in North Carolina, the cradle of American forestry, as it was called, we have so many oaks, it's ridiculous. I mean, the hardwood forests are just incredible. The most iconic tree of the American South is the angel oak. That's a live oak down in South Carolina where the South Carolina seceded from the Union. It's a giant old live oak tree. Absolutely beautiful. It's the tree on the cover of my book about medicinal trees. It's just gorgeous, and it's huge, and it's probably 1,000 years old. Oaks have so much historical significance. They actually have some religious significance. I mean, they say the Druids worshipped oak trees. Nobody really knows for sure, because what we know about the Druids was written by the Romans. The Druids were a pre-literate culture, so they didn't exactly tell us what they believed. So we know from the Romans what they think the Druids believed, even though they spoke two different languages. So take anything you read about Druid herbalism or Druid belief and practice with a grain of salt, because in truth, we don't even know what Stonehenge was all about anymore. We have ideas. We tried to figure it out, but nobody wrote down in a book what Stonehenge was all about. So anyway, some oaks do have edible nuts. Really, all acorns are edible to an extent. You have to leach the tannins out of most. Now, there are certain white oaks and bur oaks that have just wonderful nuts. So you can just, pick off, well, you don't pick them off the tree. You pick them up off the ground because they fall when they're ripe. And you can eat them. Just shell them and eat them. They're delicious. If you ever find a tree like that, save those seeds because they're actually quite valuable. They're what are called a noble oak tree, an oak that grows edible acorns that you can just eat right out of hand. It's one of the most valuable of all trees. People have been known to spend thousands of dollars on just one little sapling from a noble oak. Sometimes oak trees that are considered to be too tannic to eat also have edible acorns. I was down at one of my family cemeteries a couple years ago, and they had big water oaks growing there. They have little acorns. Usually the smaller the acorn, the higher the tannin content, and the less you can eat it readily. And I was hungry, and I thought, I'll just try one. Picked one up, cracked it open, ate it. It was as sweet a nut as a pecan. Ended up eating a handful of them right there. You never know until you try. And you can have a stand of oaks growing side by side, and they'll vary from tree to tree. Now, the way you process tannic acorns for eating is you have to leach them. This can be done basically 3 ways. Okay, the most traditional way is to get all your acorns, shell them, put them in a bag, a mesh bag, a pillowcase, whatever you got, put it in a creek, and just let the water flow through it. That's probably the most traditional, easiest way. You can also crush them up and boil them 4 or 5 times, draining off the water. You can do it a lot faster that way. It's not doesn't yield in as good a texture for the nut. You can't store them once they've been done that way. The ones that are actually soaked in water, you can dry them out and store them. If you have crushed them up, or ground them even, I guess you could do that, and done the boil method, they're going to have to be cooked right away. They're not going to keep. So you can use that to bread, fish, or chicken with, and fry it, kind of pan fry it. You don't want to deep fry it. It's going to burn very quickly. A lot of fat in any kind of nut. You could make a meal out of them and put them in, cakes, bread, pancakes, anything you would use a nut meal for. You can use that method. It's very good. One that a lot of foragers recommend that I am not entirely sure about is sort of a modern version of the soak in the creek method, and that's to put them in a mesh bag or a cloth bag and put them in the tank of your toilet. They will soak out the tannins in there, and every time you flush the toilet, clean water comes in and keeps rinsing them. I have an issue with this because yes, technically that water in the back of your toilet is clean. Meaning it's not contaminated like the water in the bowl of your toilet. But most times when I take the back off of a toilet, there's a lot of mold and mildew in there, and I don't like that idea. I'm sure it works, but it probably works better in a very dry environment. Like if you're in the desert Southwest or something, you probably don't get a lot of mold and mildew on your toilet because there's just not enough humidity in the air. So that's probably more suited to that climate, but I don't know. I have a spring up from my house. I have a creek that comes down from the spring. There's actually a little spring house, a little enclosure around the mouth of the spring. I can soak acorns up there anytime I want to. Got big old white oaks in my yard, and it's not an issue for me. That's the route I'm going to go. And when you do that, you do get the best quality because you're soaking in that good, clean, cold water, and you can then dry them, parch them for storage if you want to. So, going back to the herbal uses of oak, oak has documented use in herbal medicine as long as our history goes back. Dioscorides wrote that each part of the oak is astringent. The layer between the bark and the wood is similar to that that's under the acorn, and it is most therapeutic for the bowels. A decoction of this is given for intestinal complaints, dysentery, for spitting of blood. It's very astringent. It will stop internal bleeding. It will stop excessive menstrual bleeding. It's one of our go-to remedies, one of those emergency ones for bad diarrhea or bad bleeding of any kind. Could also be used made into what they call pessaries or suppositories, essentially inserted to stop excessive discharges of menstrual bleeding, essentially. It can also be used in baths, hot baths. He says the acorns are diuretic. That means, of course, takes off excess fluid. And but he didn't like eating them as nuts. I guess he didn't really understand removing the tannins because he said it causes headache. And yes, those tannins can make you sick. They can make you very sick. But even when they were not tannic, he thought they caused flatulence, which they're fibers. So yeah, I guess. Anyway, decoction of the bark taken with cow's milk would help against poisonings, he believed. And the unripe ones, pounded into small pieces and applied as a poultice, relieve inflammation. You'd also mix it with essentially lard and use it the same way. Good for burns, good for cuts, good for bleeding. Anything where you need to astringe and tighten up that tissue. Oak galls are really extremely tannic. That's where a wasp kind of gets in the bark and lays its larvae, and the oak seals that area off to protect it. You can tan leather with oak galls. You can tan leather with oak bark in general, but the galls are the highest concentration. Gerard wrote 1500s England, and of course, Gerard was the Queen's gardener, and William Shakespeare was his neighbor. And they loved their oak trees, and many of those plays, like A Midsummer Night's Dream and such, were written in Gerard's forest garden that he kept for the Queen, under those big oak trees. And I mean, it's such a huge part of British folklore and history. He says the leaves, the bark, the acorn cups, and the acorns themselves do mightily bind and dry. And the best of them, saith Galen, is the thin skin under the bark of the tree, that which lieth nearest to the pulp or the inner surface of the acorn. All these stay the whites, that's again a vaginal discharge, the reds, the spitting of blood, and the lask. The decoction of these is given in a powder of them dried for the purposes aforesaid. If acorns, if they be eaten, are hardly concocted and yield no nourishment to man's body. Well, we know that not to be true. Again, I guess he didn't understand about the leaching out of tannins, because once you actually leach the tannins out, or you have what's called a noble oak, one that has a low tannin acorn, really one of the most nutritious of all tree nuts. He said swine fed on them were particularly valued, having hard and sound flesh. He said the acorns provoke urine, it's diuretic, and are good against all venom and poison, but they are not of such a stopping and binding faculty as the leaves and bark. Yes, if you have internal bleeding of any kind, if you have diarrhea, if you have to stop bleeding from a wound, I would prefer pine pitch for that, but if you can get to oak bark, just grab a limb and scrape the bark off and make a decoction. A decoction is we put 1 part of bark to 2 parts water, and we boil the water down by half. Then you can really astringe that tissue. It's very styptic. It stops the bleeding, and it works really well. He mentions oak apples against fluxes of the blood and lask. That's actually the galls. They were called oak apples in the 1500s. Says the oak apple stayeth the women's diseases and causeth the mother that is fallen down to return again to the natural place. He's actually talking about vaginal prolapse, and that astringent tissue tightening quality seems to be rather effective, and that's usually done as a bath. The same steeped in strong white wine vinegar with a little powder of brimstone, that's sulfur, and the root of, I'm not sure what it, Erios, and he doesn't define that, would make the hair black. Okay, so oak bark, if you make a decoction of it, it will make a very black, a very dark tea, essentially. And yeah, it'll dye your hair. I don't think you have to combine it with brimstone or anything, but he also said it was good for sunburns, and it is, because again, it tightens, it astringes the tissue, it reduces inflammation. He also used it for freckles and spots and such as that. Let's get to Culpeper. About 100 years later, he said so well known he didn't have to describe it. So yeah, and oaks are probably that well known today. I mean, that's like the one tree just about anybody can identify. Yeah, the inner bark of the tree and the thin skin that covers the acorn are most used to stay the spitting of blood and the bloody flux. The decoction of the bark or the cups of the acorns do stay vomiting, spitting of blood, bleeding at the mouth, or other fluxes of blood in men and women. Lasks also, that's essentially diarrhea. And nocturnal involuntary flux of men. Wet dreams. believe it or not. Yes, that tightening of the tissue was believed, and they were very concerned about that in the 15 and 1600s. Not sure why, but yeah, they had a lot of herbal remedies. The acorn in powder taken in wine provokes the urine and resists the poison of venomous creatures. The decoction of the acorns and the bark made in milk and taken resists the force of poisonous herbs and medicine. So also, even by the 1600s, being used as a remedy against poisons. That's interesting. We may need to look into that. I mean, because you never know when your kid's going to eat something you shouldn't eat, right? But I have no medical evidence of that whatsoever. Just anecdotal. Said it was good for the bladder, voids bloody urine, excess fluids, etc. Yeah, and we get into a lot of stuff we already covered. Oh, also good for the liver. It's very bitter. Good for the kidney stones as a diuretic. And would stay women's courses, of course. Applied. Oh, this is interesting. The water found in a hollow place of an old oak tree is very effectual against these foul or spreading scabs. They thought it was good for skin infections, essentially. I don't know. It may well be. It would just be rainwater that was in the hollow of an oak tree. So it's a natural decoction. I don't see why you couldn't just make it in your house, in a pot. But, whatever. Getting up to more modern use, we're talking 1930s. Miss Grieve really gets into the history and lore. And I love herbal folklore, but I'm not going to read everything she wrote because she's got, 1,000 years of history. I mean, she apparently, she said that both the Greeks and Druids venerated the oak tree. I don't know. Like I said, most of what we know about the Druids was written by the Romans. Who knows? But the Romans apparently thought it was special as well and dedicated to Jupiter. So, I mean, it's just a big, strong tree. And they live a long time, and people have certain associations with them. I know that the Romans said that the Druids thought that mistletoe that grew on an oak tree had magical properties. That all I know is that the Romans said the Druids did. We have no evidence that the Druids ever held that belief whatsoever. So anyway, you take all that with a grain of salt. She gives a lot of interesting anecdotes and poems, and this is Miss Greaves, A Modern Herbal. It's all in my book if you want to read it, or you can get her book. 2 volumes, one of the best you can have. But under medicinal actions and uses, she says, the astringent effects of oak were well known to the ancients, by whom different parts of the trees were used. But it is the bark which is now employed in medicine. Its action is slightly tonic, strongly astringent, and antiseptic. It has a strong astringent bitter taste, and its qualities are extracted both by water and spirits or alcohol, and the odor is slightly aromatic. It does smell pretty good, actually. Like other astringents, it has been recommended in agues, its fevers, hemorrhages, and is a good substitute for quinine in intermittent fever, especially when given with chamomile. It's useful in chronic diarrhea and dysentery, or either alone or in conjunction with other aromatics, and talks about everything from sore throat to prolapse again. So interesting. Now, having said, apparently this is like the sacred tree of the Irish. Well, we get to John Kehoe in the 1700s. He gives us 1 sentence. No, I'm sorry, 2 sentences. The Irish herbal gives us 2 sentences on oak, so bear that in mind. All parts of the oak have a binding nature and therefore are useful against diarrhea and dysentery, hemorrhages, and flows of all kind. The bark can be used in gargles or for dropped uvula. Yeah. So the loquacious Irishman gives us 2 sentences, so maybe the oak wasn't as revered as the Romans seem to think it was. Granted, there's 1,000 years between those 2 accounts. Things could have changed in Ireland over time, but one would think if the oak was that, important in Ireland, he would have written more than 17 words. But anyway, Father Nape, going to the German tradition, talked about oak bark. And he says, are we then to even use the bark of oak as medicine? Certainly. Be it fresh from the tree or dried, young bark of oak boiled for about a half hour gives a sanative decoction. A small towel dipped into it and tied as a bandage round the neck. Such bandages give great help to people afflicted with thick throats, and even with a wen on the throat. If it has not yet grown too large and firm, the decoction operates as a most effective and harmless remedy. Complaints of the glands are removed just as thoroughly by these bandages. Whoever is troubled with prolapse of the rectum may often take sitting baths in a decoction of oak bark, and also from time to time an enema of the diluted decoction. The troublesome and often dangerous fistula of the rectum is dissolved and healed by the decoction. Also, hard tumors, if they are not inflamed, may be treated and dissolved in the same way. Tea made of oak bark operates like resin in a strengthening way on the inner vessels. His protege, who was more of a professional herbalist, Brother Aloysius, wrote the acorns together with the bark and leaves are used medicinally. The acorns are gathered in autumn, burned, and ground into a powder. When steeped in boiling water to make acorn coffee, they are highly recommended for scrofula, that's infected glands of the throat, and in many dispositions which stem from it, such as diarrhea, abdominal swelling, anemia, and leukorrhea. Use 1 sugar spoon powdered acorn in a cup of water. The bark can be removed from 2 or 3-year-old branches. It has no smell, but a very astringent taste, and is used externally in the form of a compress, baths, washes, syringes, gargles, etc. For a gargle, take 2 to 4 teaspoons of the bark per 2 cups of water. For a compress, 2/3 to 1 cup of leaves or bark per 2 cups of water. Internally, 1 to 2 teaspoons of powder bark should be taken in syrup, honey, etc. to control heavy menstrual bleeding, blood spitting, blood in the stools. A bark is also used externally in the form of a compress for lupus, soft, rotten ulcers, sores, etc. An excellent remedy for leukorrhea is to boil a handful of oak bark for 15 minutes in 4 cups of water, strain and syringe or insert this quantity every evening. Drink 1 cup of oak bark tea daily for blood spitting, heavy bleeding, painful bleeding, urinary incontinence, chronic dysentery, and excessive mucus. So very useful. Actually, in modern times, the herbalist with whom I wrote the book, The Herbs and Weeds of Father Johann Kunzel, Jelana Wittub says, oak bark is my strongest anti-inflammatory, antiseptic home medicine. I always have oak bark at home, but thank God I seldom need it. I collect oak bark the same way I collect willow bark and keep it dried in a jar. I would use oak bark decoction externally for washing wounds which do not heal properly or for very strong perspiration of the feet. Interesting use, very traditional use actually, sweaty feet. But Father, I think, Kunzel and Nape actually liked sweaty feet. They thought that was a sign of health. So anyway, she says I use oak bark in my recipe for fermented cucumbers. Yes, oak leaves, I meant to say, not oak bark. Very tannic, very good for keeping your cucumber pickles crisp. I do that as well. She talks about using acorns for food, and we've already discussed that. The Lumbee Indians use red oak, and that's one of the more tannic oaks. It's Lumbee Herbal says a handful of red oak bark was boiled until the water became deep red. The wash was used by Lumbee healers to rub on the skin and that was affected by poison oak. The Lumbee also used red oak in an external wash to bathe or to aid the treatment of chills and fever. A tea made from the red oak was used by many Lumbee healers to aid the system, especially after long fevers. The bark was also used as an astringent, a tonic, and an antiseptic. The tea was drank to serve as an emetic, means to make you throw up. It's very tannic. It will actually make you throw up. And smaller amounts to treat indigestion, chronic dysentery, asthma, the debility of the system. The bark was used externally and applied to sore, chapped skin. Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests in the 1860s talks of black oak, another very strong one. Good for leukorrhea, amenorrhea, diarrhea, rheumatism because of its shrinking the tissue. It can be used as a good soak for arthritic joints. Pulmonary consumption to stop the bleeding. Tonsillitis, asthma, the galls or balls as they call them are powerful astringent. Useful in diarrhea, dysentery, hemorrhage, and intermittent fever. Used as a gargle, especially for tonsillitis. Let's see if there's anything. Oh, white oak. Yeah, says similar to the black oak, but not as active upon the bowels. Not as astringent, in other words. Let's see. Okay, King's Medical Dispensatory, 1898. Says oak bark is slightly tonic, meaning a little bit of the extraction, whatever way you use, is good for digestion. Powerfully astringent and antiseptic. It is used in chronic diarrhea, chronic mucus discharges, passive hemorrhage, and whenever an internal astringent agent is required. See if there's anything we haven't covered in that. Oh, good for gangrenous or infected wounds. A powder of the bark, especially good for infected wounds and sores, even gangrene. In sickly and debilitated children, it helps with diarrhea, especially as a result of fevers. That's a decoction, basically given as a tea. Yeah, I think we covered everything there. Yeah, we have. And in modern use, Plants for Future mentions white oak, which we haven't really covered a lot. It says white oak was often used medicinally by several native North American Indian tribes who valued it especially for its antiseptic and astringent properties, and used in the treatment of many complaints. It is little, if at all, used in modern herbalism. And okay, see, I disagree with that because it's actually one of my go-to remedies, and anybody who owns my book probably does use oak bark. Maybe more people ought to buy my books. Hey, there's a good idea. Recommend my books. Let's see. It is powerfully antiseptic and astringent properties, expectorant and tonic. The bark is boiled and the liquid drunk in the treatment of bleeding piles or hemorrhoids, diarrhea, intermittent fevers, coughs and colds, consumptions, asthma, loss of voice, etc. Bark has been chewed as a treatment for mouth sores. Externally, it is used as a wash for skin eruptions, burns, rashes, bruises, ulcers, a vaginal douche. It has been used as a wash for muscular pains. The galls being more astringent. They recommend collecting the bark in the spring. Peterson Field Guide says astringent inner bark tea once used for chronic diarrhea, dysentery, chronic mucus discharge, bleeding and prolapse, piles, etc., as a gargle for sore throat and a wash for skin eruptions. Poison ivy rash burns as a hemostatic, as a folk cancer remedy, contains tannins. Tannic acid is antiviral, antiseptic, anti-tumor, and carcinogenic. So it could actually be carcinogenic. And in large amounts, potentially toxic. Definitely never want to have large amounts of tannic acid. It could be very dangerous, in fact. Botany a Day says medicinally the oaks are astringent throughout due to the tannin. The bark contains quercetin, compounds similar to salicin like aspirin. The astringency is used internally for gum inflammation, sore throat, and diarrhea. Externally used for first aid for first and second degree burns. The tannins bind to proteins and amino acids, sealing off the burns from weeping and from bacterial infections. A good first aid plant. I emphasize that a lot. The leaves can be chewed into a mash and used as an astringent poultice. Oak galls have a high tannin content, as much as 60 to 70%. I would avoid the galls. If you want to use those for tanning leather, if you want to keep a small amount for an emergency, I mainly use oak bark from the limbs, and it's much more predictable, much less chance of toxicity, in my opinion. And interestingly, the physician's desk reference, this is the doctor's book for herbal medicine, tells us it's approved by Commission E for cough, bronchitis, diarrhea, inflammation of the mouth and pharynx, inflammation of the skin. Oak is used internally for nonspecific diarrhea. In smaller doses, it is used as a stomach tonic. The drug is used externally for inflammatory skin diseases and inflammation of the mouth and throat. In folk medicine, oak is used for inflammation of the genital and anal area, suppurating eczema, a lot of different things, chilblains even. Oak is used in folk medicine internally for hemorrhagic stools, non-menstrual uterine bleeding, hematopsis, chronic inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. External uses include hemorrhoid bleeding, varicose veins, yes, a soak, hot foot bath of oak bark, very good for varicose veins. Uterine bleeding, vaginal discharge, rashes, chronic itching, scaly and suppurating eczema, and eye inflammations. They get into the galls. I think we've already covered all that. It said also the galls were used for gingivitis, and again, it's just to be that astringent tightening. You definitely don't want to drink that. That would be more as a mouthwash. So yeah. Interestingly, they said that it had some sedative hypnotic effect. I've never encountered that, but something about it could make you a little sleepy. That's all that really means. But anyway, that pretty much wraps up oak. I mean, oaks are so common and just incredibly useful. So, I mean, get to know the oaks in your area. There are probably 30 varieties growing around you right now, and all you really got to do is get out and ID them and learn to use them. And like I said, I usually do use limb bark, never off the trunk, because that can damage the tree, it can wound the tree, can lead to parasitic infection, kill the tree. But you can cut limbs and use that bark, and it's just one of the go-to, easiest, simple home remedies I know of. Y'all have a great week. I'll talk to you next time.
The information in this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or condition. Nothing I say or write has been evaluated or approved by the FDA. I'm not a doctor. The U.S. government does not recognize the practice of herbal medicine, and there is no governing body regulating herbalists. Therefore, I'm really just a guy who studies herbs. I'm not offering any advice. I won't even claim that anything I write or say is accurate or true. I can tell you what herbs have been traditionally used for. I can tell you my own experience and if I believe an herb has helped me. I cannot nor would I tell you to do the same. If you use an herb anyone recommends, you are treating yourself. You take full responsibility for your health. Humans are individuals and no two are identical. What works for me may not work for you. You may have an allergy, a sensitivity, an underlying condition that no one else even shares and you don't even know about. Be careful with your health. By continuing to listen to my podcast or read my blog, you agree to be responsible for yourself, do your own research, make your own choices, and not to blame me for anything ever.